Well, I think that this country is at a pivot point, or rather, maybe a fork in the road, or I'm not really quite sure how to word it, but there's very clearly a divergence. Something that has been brewing for a very long time in this country, long before Donald Trump ever existed or was ever, a political thought, in the mind. But the division, I think, has come. There's a new level. It's becoming increasingly likely that Donald Trump's very legitimate legal challenges are going to be completely stonewalled by the by the legal establishment, both left and right. And while I never thought that he was going to have any shot winning the case anywhere but the Supreme Court, I had completely anticipated, what we're seeing in the lower courts, rulings the where the case is getting dismissed because the charge that, say, the state of Pennsylvania, for example, did not allow proper observation. This is, the judges are sort of dismissing that claim, saying that, well, in the cases in which the observers were illegally thrown out, that they did that to both the Democratic and the Republican observers. So, there was no there was no prejudice against you. So you have no room to complain because the Democrats were also kicked out. And in the cases in which the observers weren't kicked out but were just put so far away to where they can't see, the judge says, well, you were in the room, and the statute says there has to be observers present, and you were present. Sure, you couldn't do anything because you couldn't see the darn things. But, hey, the observers are present. This complete evisceration of our election laws, it's totally deliberate. And it is obvious to anyone who wants to pay attention and is not, let's say, in the tank for, or not necessarily in the tank for Joe Biden, but in the tank against Donald Trump. And I'm someone, again, who I'm not a Trump bot. I'm not a big Trump fan. I've been critical of him for his entire 4 years in office. I was critical of him before he got elected. I did not vote for him in 2016. But I am an honest enough person to see the way that he has been clearly mistreated by our system. And so if I can see this, I can tell you that not only are the reasonable people looking at this seeing, what a joke our electoral system has become, but all of his supporters do as well. That's a guaranteed thing. Even if someone like me who looked at this honestly and tried to weigh the merits of the arguments of the people saying our election was 100% up on the up and up, and the Trump people who say that the election was rigged, if I come to the conclusion that the Trump people are largely correct, not everything they say can be 100% backed up, which, by the way, I'll get to that. It doesn't matter if they can't be 100% backed up. I mean, nothing Trump has ever said can be 100% backed up. He exaggerates. That's kind of just in his nature. But even if I ultimately came down on the side of the anti-Trump people and saying that this election was 100% free and fair, you would still have most of Trump's supporters siding with him just based on his word alone. And so if a significant portion of the United States population no longer has faith in our elections, that is that's a place that we have that I don't think we've ever seen before. That's not the kind of that's not exactly what you'd call a stable democracy at that point. I think that the fiction of a united America at this point has completely been eviscerated by reality. It doesn't matter if these judges come in here and in their effort to try and preserve the public's confidence in our elections by completely throwing out any of these challenges that the Trump people are bringing, any of these very reasonable challenges, just completely stonewalling them and dismissing them on hand, not even allowing an evidentiary hearing. the intention of this is to make people think that their claims are totally ridiculous. You're supposed to take the judge's word for it, essentially, and not look into things too closely yourself, because the judges feel that, like, well, if you even question the integrity of the election, that undermines the integrity in our election. It's like when you check your credit score goes down. These judges want the American people to keep loaning the government more and more of their trust without ever checking their credit score. That is essentially how the view that these judges have. And we've reached the point to where the judges no longer have the power to do that. And by shutting down the Trump campaign's lawsuits in this way, by all of these states not allowing any audits, not allowing signature match verification, not allowing observers of the initial vote count or of the recounts, all of these things, they're forcing people to wake up. Trump supporters are quickly realizing that they cannot, that the system that they elected Trump, within, that they elected him to try and reform, to shake up, is so resilient and so unfair that elections are not the way to change it. And this is something that the establishment really needs to consider. Do you want Trump supporters thinking that? Because it's not just like you get Joe Biden in there by hook or by crook, and then Trump and his supporters all go away. Because Trump is a product. Trump is not like the problem. If he's a problem to you, he's not the problem. He's not the root of the problem. He's a symptom. The problem started long before that. I mean, the problem goes back to, at the very least, you can trace the origins of Trump back to, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street and Ron Paul's presidential campaign, and back even further if you want to go maybe to 9/11 Truth or to Waco. The dissent against the American establishment, the roots of this goes back a pretty long way in recent history. The Democratic Party did a pretty good job co-opting the radical baby boomers from the 1960s and incorporating them into their party as fixtures of the establishment. But the Republican Party actually the Democratic Party, you could say the same, with regards to the Occupy Wall Street people and the Occupy Everywhere people. The left of the 2000s, the post-2008 left, has not been properly integrated into the Democratic Party. They have a big civil war going on there. And the Republicans, before 2016, from really 2008, when nobody wanted John McCain, and he rightfully lost because people just didn't like him. He's a bad candidate. He went against everything that the anti-establishment spirit within the GOP wanted. John McCain and Mitt Romney were emblematic of everything that the Republican base wanted to overthrow. And it was that energy after 2008, the counterpart to the Occupy Wall Street people, the Tea Party folks, that led to, in 2010, much of the Republican establishment getting primary challengers from the right, who were supposed to be, more principled types, anti-establishment politicians. And over the next few years, the GOP establishment in Washington was able to co-opt those individuals, those personalities, for the most part. As far as today goes, the only real Tea Party folks you have left in Washington who are in the Republican Party who are still pretty much in line with who they were when they ran back in 2010 or 12, or like Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, Thomas Massey. There are probably others. I can't think of too many of them, but most of them folded and went along with what the GOP was doing in Washington, and they took their seat at the table, and they very happily sold out. And the GOP thought that they had subsumed and co-opted the anti-establishment energy that sort of peaked in 2010 visibly, but that wasn't the case. They co-opted the people who channeled that energy in the electoral process, but they did not. But once those people sold out, the Republican base sought a new champion, and that was Donald Trump. And the reason why they picked Trump is because, for the same reason they picked all of those primary challengers to a bunch of Republican establishment figures back in 2010, because they were trying to pick someone from outside the system and put him in there to shake things up. It was the same thing. 2016 was very much like 2010 in that respect in the Republican primary. These were people on the right who felt like our system was not working for them, and they wanted to do something to change it. And so they elected Donald Trump. Now, many of those same people, I would say probably a majority of them, are going to come away from this, especially once I think there's more studying done about this election. Once the once the signatures and things on the ballots become public record, people really start digging through them with a fine-tooth comb, because all this is public record. After the election, after everything's settled, after assuming Joe Biden becomes the president, it's going to be obvious that this was not a free and fair election. And if that's the case, if this is different than trying to co-opt the anti-establishment energy. This is trying to snuff it out, and that's not a smart strategy. So the Republican base felt like they had found someone who would be their champion, so to speak. And they tried to play ball within the system. And they were cheated. What do you think the response then is going to be to that? Do you see where I'm going with this? These people are going to eventually reach the conclusion that you cannot reform the system by working within it. And this brings me to a prediction today that was made by Michael Malice, I think one of the more insightful people in media. It's a great book, The New Right, that you guys should read. It was kind of a retrospective of not just the alt-right from a couple of years ago, but just things in general, 4chan culture. It's a fun read if you were someone who plays around in the fringes of the internet. But anyway, Malice's prediction was that within the next year, some outlet, some alternative media outlet, presumably, will emerge to contextualize right-wing social unrest. And once that happens, we're off to the races. And what he means by that is that the right typically is a group of Boy Scouts. Right-wingers, they like rules, they like order, they like authority. They try and be nice to the cops. They embrace the symbolism of the American Revolution and resistance and all these things, but it's not really in their DNA. It's not really in their nature. They naturally feel good, expressing deference to authority figures, such as the police or the military. But after being defeated in this way, by not being betrayed by their own guy, Donald Trump, these people don't feel like they were betrayed by Trump. They feel like the system betrayed them. And that even though they got one of their own guys into the system, they still couldn't win. And they look at, what happened this past year with the left, with their mass unrest, their violence in the streets, and the way that the media completely defended all of them and said that was legitimate, and all of these outrageous things. Malice is basically alluding to the, I think, maybe not substantial, but to the possibility that we start to see similar behavior out of the right. Much in the same way that we're already seeing people on the right form a hashtag resist kind of mentality when it comes to a potential Biden administration. We are also going to see people on the right embracing extra political means of advancing their political goals. And that very quickly, rather than accepting the media's characterization, which inevitably will be, oh my gosh, right-wing Nazi terrorists rising up in the streets. This is a terrible thing, unlike when it was Black Lives Matter or Antifa, in which, well, see, these are the people who are against the fascists. They're just like World War II veterans. When you see people on the right rising up in the streets against lockdowns or against perhaps proposed gun control measures, they won't be seen as freedom fighters by the media. And folks in the alternative media likely will not jump on board with what the mainstream media is saying. Your more right-leaning media is probably going to portray these people in a similar light to how the mainstream media portrayed Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And so, I guess to summarize things so far, the left over the last 4 years, or specifically over the last year, has fully embraced political violence. Punch and Nazi very quickly turned into, burning down cities is a mostly peaceful action. And of course, a totally legitimate form of grief when a black man is killed in an interaction with a police officer. Or it's a completely legitimate form of reacting to, ordinary Republicans holding a protest march in your city. It's totally okay to burn down buildings and to murder people, in the case of that one guy in Portland, so long as you're doing it against the evil Nazi menace. And so, since the left, in their time in the opposition, playing the opposition party, while you had a Republican president, took that position, it is sort of inevitable that the right will move in that direction as well once they become the opposition party. Needless to say, then, the coronation of Joe Biden, the selection rather than the election of Joe Biden, if it does indeed go through, and of course we haven't seen any of Trump's cases get to the Supreme Court yet, but again, something that very much worries me is that Trump doesn't have any lawyers. There are no real lawyers who really want to represent him. The entire legal establishment, left and right, particularly the Republicans and the Federalist Society and all that, have no interest in pleading his case, because they think that if he's cheated out of this, that he will just go away and that his supporters will go away and we'll be able to get back to normal. That simply is not true. And that should be concerning, to everybody, really. Unless, you're someone who likes political violence. I don't. But if you... Gosh, what was the old saying? Something about if you make sort of a peaceful resistance or a peaceful revolution impossible, a violent revolution becomes inevitable. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to imply that there's going to be some, right-wing anti-establishment revolution in this country, and then all of a sudden they're going to take over and have some kind of, I don't know, strongman dictator who's going to, reorganize American society. Nothing like that. That's obviously unrealistic. But what you are going to have is you're going to have a significant portion of the population of the United States who does not recognize the authority of our governing institutions for good reason. And you will have a country that is more divided than it currently is, more divided than it has been at all, since 1860. And so it's hard to say where that leads, but I know where it doesn't lead. It does not lead back to a united America. It does not lead back to, a return to normalcy. All the stuff that these sort of neoliberal Biden supporters dream of. I mean, that's a fantasy. There is no return to what once was. What once was, the time, let's say, up until the end of the Bush administration, up until 2008, really, that time where you had this general bipartisan consensus, when you had skull versus bones, as I think that was Jon Stewart's joke or The Daily Show's joke about the 2004 election. You had, George W. Bush and John Kerry, who are both in the Skull and Bones fraternity at Yale. That's how different they are. They literally were in the same fraternity and at the same college. And these were supposed to represent, the two competing visions of America. It was a total nonsense. It was, it was a song and dance. It was a uniparty. That's what America had become. And there is a nostalgia amongst some, amongst mostly, your upper middle class white folks, for a return to that period. They love this picture of Michelle Obama hugging George W. Bush. But the fantasy of that time period has been broken. People recognize George W. Bush and Barack Obama for being, for one thing, murderous warmongers. And so right now, we're in a time of uncertainty in this country. It's unclear what a politically stable and a politically healthy America looks like, but it doesn't look like that. It's going to be something very different. Things necessarily will get worse before they get better. And because of that, I hope that things, can move along as quickly as possible and we can just sort of rip the Band-Aid off. There must be new political arrangements in order for the various interest groups in the United States, the warring factions, to come to terms with each other's existence. You can't simply try and quash Donald Trump politically and think that the trends that led to his initial election will just disappear. You can't think that all of his supporters will disappear. In fact, it's quite possible that not only will the chaos, the perceived chaos of the last 4 years not abate under a President Joe Biden, but it may possibly accelerate. And I think that that's not such a crazy assumption. Now, I guess before I end, because I could go on about this all day, I just want to give I want to clarify that I'm still optimistic for the future of this country. Where we were a few years ago was not a good place. Where we are now is also not a good place, but I think that we're on the road to finding a good place. We need to find that new equilibrium to where people can be happy. The divisions in this country cannot be erased, they cannot be ignored, and they shouldn't be. They should be resolved. And they aren't resolved by everyone adopting the same ideology and adopting the same cultural values. That's not going to happen. It happens by people accepting their differences and going their separate ways, erasing our political ties so that we are no longer constrained by one another. That's ultimately how we will find peace in this country. The question is, how bad and for how long do things have to go on before people accept that and before we start to seriously consider what must be done. I was convinced that if Donald Trump won re-election, that would be enough of a wake-up call for the left to realize that the people who voted for Donald Trump the first time, that was not just simply a mistake. They didn't, do something wrong. But this is a fundamentally evil and racist country, and there's no saving. That was what I thought. If Donald Trump won, that's what the left would think. But likewise, if Joe Biden ends up prevailing, despite the many irregularities with our election, and even more so because of that, the right will realize, as I've been alluding to throughout this video, that the system that they elected Donald Trump to shake up cannot be so easily reformed. And so therefore, the idea of a national divorce is going to become increasingly mainstream. You even had, some decent, not radical by any means, conservative commentators over the past 4 years who have been coming to this conclusion already. But it's not so much something that is commonly talked about amongst ordinary voters. But I think that it will be over the next 4 years, once, if Biden is inaugurated. And that is a political goal for the right that I think would lead to substantive positive change for them and for the left. So no matter who is president, neither of them, will save this country. I came to that conclusion in 2016. It's part of the reason why I didn't vote in that election. I didn't think that voting for Donald Trump would save America. So I didn't really know what to do. But in the 4 years in the interim, from 2016 to 2020, I came to the conclusion that the best way to move on is to try and push people in the right direction, rather than trying to directly convince them of what I think would be the right idea, and that is, political decentralization or national divorce, whatever you want to call it, the end of Washington's hegemony, a dismantling of our established political order. If people are pushed, they'll come to that conclusion on their own. I don't necessarily need to just convince them of it in the abstract. And so I will continue to monitor this situation, and I appreciate those of you who have stuck around for this entire video. If you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.